All right. So now the important thing that we want to talk about is the church. How does the
Mhm.
church actually confront cultural and social issues? I mean, we're always told that mixing religion and politics is the number one
Right.
sin, right? I've also heard plenty of Christians say our job isn't to win the culture wars. Our job is to win souls to Christ. Is that valid? Is that naive? What's our job as the church?
Mm. That's a good question. Do you
Yeah.
want to? You want to take a stab at it first, Tim, or you want me to roll?
Whatever.
Yeah,
Or
I'll
Stratton?
talk about that. It's kind of crazy when somebody. Well, I mean, Adam, you already noted that Christians are called to seek justice.
Yeah.
Well, you can't do that apart from politics, unless you want to say that you're supposed to be a vigilante or something like
Very
that.
true. Very true.
Right, so you have to do it through politics, and so it's absurd to say that you shouldn't that Christians getting involved in politics is sinful or something like that. You know, well, if God does not exist, like we said before, then humanity was not created on purpose or for a specific purpose. And if we were just mere accidents on atheism, if God does not exist, then you're nothing but an accident. So nothing's really good or really objectively right or anything like that. So on atheism, it would not really be wrong, objectively speaking, no matter what happens. But if God exists and Christianity is true, then one's subjective political opinions can actually be objectively right or objectively wrong. So there can be good laws,
Yep.
and there can actually be unlawful laws. So when you think about what Chief Justice Jackson in the Nuremberg trials, condemning the Nazis, he appealed to the law above the law. And so this is a political maneuver appealing to the objective purpose of life and really what the Declaration of Independence is talking about, that there are some things that are objectively wrong, no matter who you are or where you live, and you can't violate other human rights like that. So with all that in mind, I mean, this gives Christians an ultimate foundation to be the best politicians and to be involved in politics more than anybody else. In fact, it's Christians who ought to be the politicians because you understand ultimate reality. And so the laws that you're passing and the laws that you seek to pass or the laws that you seek to change, you understand, Adam, you referred to this as the background information. Well, we're talking about the foundation of reality and what makes things really right and really wrong. And so you can have good laws and bad laws. And so it's really Christians who ought to be involved. And, I'd also say that Jesus was involved in politics. He was constantly going after the Pharisees, right? Well, guess what? They weren't just the religious people of the day. They were also the politicians.
That's right. That's right.
It was going after him. He says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you give a tenth of your spices, right? But then he says, you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Right? So he's going after these guys. So that's the first thing to know is Jesus was involved in politics. So is Paul, by the way. He would appeal to political law, things like that. But secondly, if a Christian doesn't take politics seriously, then they probably don't really take evangelism seriously. And Frank Turek, a friend of ours, everybody knows Frank, right? He shows he likes to show a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula to make a point. And, he says, notice the stark contrast between the North and the South. He says, South Korea is just filled with light. It's lit up with activity. You can see this from the satellite image. It's just lit up. And, Turek says that it's one of the most Christianized countries in the world. But then North Korea, on the other hand, we're all familiar with North Korea now, right? It stands in polar contrast to their neighbors to the south. And North Korea is dark. I mean, when you look at it, it's like you can see one little light in it. It's just dark. It's seemingly dead. And
that's probably the president's his house or something like that. It's like the one light.
That's right. It probably is. But Frank Turek says we can summarize this drastic difference in one word: politics. It's politics.
Yeah.
And so many South Koreans have heard the gospel of Jesus Christ because there's political freedom there to share the gospel. But the communistic government of North Korea, on the other hand, doesn't allow the gospel to be shared. It's a dictatorship. So with that in mind, if you're a Christian, then you should know that the gospel message is the most important information a person could ever have access to or possess. And if you truly love all people as Jesus commanded, then you've got to desire the people who have never heard the gospel to have access to this eternally vital information. So since politics is keeping millions of souls from hearing the gospel, well, if you truly love and care for all humans, then you should really care about politics. And so that is to say, to not care about politics is to not care about people. And as Christians, we are commanded to love and care for all people. So that's my thoughts. You mentioned if
just real quickly, I can.
Yeah, the culture wars. What about the culture wars? If not putting aside politics, what about the culture wars?
Well, yeah, just if I could, real quick. I mean, now actually, I'm not sure if this is to be attributed to him, but I heard Tony Evans say, Pastor Tony Evans, excuse me. So often we think about the hope of the gospel, but we don't really have a clear understanding of the scope of the gospel. He differentiates between the hope of the gospel and the scope of the gospel. And really, when you think about what we're called to be as Christians, we're being conformed to the image of Christ, and Christ is the exemplification of what the Imago Dei was intended to be in the first place. We're being conformed to that image. Now, I'm not going to do a whole teaching on it now, but people can check out my website, my YouTube page rather,
hey,
and see where I talk about
True ID. Plug it.
True ID Apologetics, TRUID Apologetics here on YouTube. And I talk about, when you think about the Imago Dei, an aspect of it is that really mankind is commissioned on this collective project to harness the earth and steward it in a way that represents God. Right. That's what we're supposed to be doing. It's a collective project. So individually, we're made in the image of God, but also there's a collective aspect to it, too. So obviously, in this fallen world, that collective project hasn't gone away. But when the Bible calls us to justice, I mean, it's really kind of hearkening to that. I mean, we ought to be in the world stewarding it in a way that reflects God and his character, And so when I think about, what's going on now with justice and the culture wars, yes, Christians ought to be about the business of involving ourselves in those kinds of things. Absolutely. Because it's a part of our mandate as being made in the image of God, and that being kind of reiterated, now that we are covenant children of Christ, we ought to be going about, doing good as Jesus did. As a matter of fact, it talks about one of my favorite scriptures, actually it's short, but in Romans, I think it's chapter 12, it's do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. That's a command. That's a general principle that we ought to be abiding by as we interact with the world. Now, that being said, we also have to look at the counterbalance to that in the sense that, it's like Paul talks about us not being entangled with the affairs of the world. Now, let me be explicit in terms of, where I'm going with that. St. Augustine from North Africa, he wrote a book called City of God, where he clearly lays out how there's the world, the city of man, and then there's the city of God. Yeah. And like these two cities are cohabitants on the earth, if you will, but they don't mix. There's a definitive line between the two. But there's some intersection, given the fact that we're cohabitants, that we have to interact with one another. And the Christian ought to always be mindful that we are representatives of the city of God. And in any way that we interact with the city of man, we ought to keep that, in the forefront. And so really, as Christians, as the people of God, the city of God, we ought to be united, interacting with the world in ways that reflect God's nature. And we can't lose sight and get entangled with certain political parties and certain, this, that, and the third. We ought to always approach it from a transcendent perspective. Because if we don't, so you have some people who believe that the conservative spectrum side of the political house is like the political extension of the church or something like that, which is obviously false. Then you have some people that believe that, liberals have some good things to say, and maybe on this or that account they exemplify a particular biblical moral. But the reality is, the Christians, we have this bag of moral principles that can't be accommodated by either side of the spectrum. What we ought to be doing is coming to the world, interacting with the world from our vantage point, this transcendent place, and enacting justice. You know what I'm saying? And in whichever way that we can involve ourselves in politics to accomplish that, there might be some times where there's overlap, with the conservatives. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't, or what have you. But we've got to keep the distinctions clear in terms of, we're sojourners in this world, and if we lose sight of that, then we end up being co-opted by the world rather than being a redeeming agent in it.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, the whole concept of, we just can't we have to forget about the culture and just focus on Christ. That's one of the few things that really wants to set me off when I hear Christians say that. It's like, well, okay, do you love people? Yes. Well, then you should love the culture, because cultures are made up of people. And a culture is just like these common beliefs, common system of values that people share together, and it's molded by people, and it also molds people. So culture kind of goes both ways, that we mold it and it molds us back as well. And it's not that, our main focus is like, forcing everybody to say Merry Christmas. You know what I mean? Like that's the wrong kind of cultural attention. But just the fact that people, and also this spills into apologetics once again, where like people can't even think in religious categories anymore. Like they don't get the concept of sin anymore, whatnot, because we're just so separated now. Christianity is so separated from the culture. Sure, they're going to be Christians that say, well, that's a good thing because now we got a blank slate. But if you care about people, you need to care about the culture, and vice versa. Because let's face it, if you're a Christian parent, there's going to come a certain age where the culture might be more influential on your child than you are. Their friends at school, the things that they watch on TV. And so if you can in any way help shape that, you're indirectly helping to shape your child. And also you're helping to shape the rest of the world. And I know, Strat, you were talking about politics, making sure that we're living in a free country, but it's more than just politics. It's also shaping the culture to make the culture like a conduit that the gospel can be received in, which is more than just politics. Because, hey, even if the government suddenly shut down, the First Amendment tomorrow, we still need to be able to get the message out,
Yeah, that's right.
And the culture is that conduit, which beliefs are passed. So what kind of beliefs are going to be passed, true ones or false ones? So we also want to shape the culture. Winning the culture war is not our top priority. We want to influence the culture so we can have a greater influence for Christ.
And what you're saying is very biblical, because I think one of the mistakes that we often make here in the West is sometimes we read a particular brand of individualism into the biblical text, when the biblical text is written in a society that's far more collective oriented, than what we would be familiar with. It's almost like anathema to hear today. But if you just read the scriptures, there's a reason why God can judge a whole nation and do so justly. It's because you have, sin can be so pervasive in a culture, to your point, that God can rightly just judge a whole nation. I mean, it's not a game, Like, we really have to understand exactly what you're saying. Like, think about the reverse. I mean, if you have a culture that's, rooted in the gospels, one way or the other, then you would expect that culture to have less sin in it, right? I mean, obviously. Yeah. So why not be an agent for godly change? But I think that, even scripturally speaking, I think that we would do well to attend to those scriptures that really point to, like, what, actually, I'm not just an island, functioning in society. No, I really am interconnected with other people, and God cares about that.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to add, Strat? Because, man, we're
we
an hour
just
51 minutes. Like, I've flown over a lot. Anything else to add, Strat?